Hello everyone, this is Jesse Briscoe. This is part 3 of a 3-part series regarding implicit bias. In this video, we are going to address implicit bias in the hiring process. First, let's examine some characteristics of implicit bias. It's important to note that everyone actually possesses implicit biases. Implicit and explicit biases are related, but have very distinct mental constructs. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. It's also important to note that we generally tend to uphold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. And lastly, the implicit associations that we have formed can gradually be unlearned. So how is implicit bias a bad thing? Unconscious biases actually have a critical and problematic effect on our judgment. Unconscious biases cause us to make decisions in favor of one person or group to the detriment of others. In the workplace, unconscious biases can prevent or hinder opportunities to value diversity, recruiting, promotion, and retention efforts. Left unchecked, biases can shape a company or industry's culture and norms. Let's examine 2 different studies involving implicit bias. In one study, applicants with white-sounding names actually received 50% more interview invitations than those with African American names. In another study, blind auditions for symphony orchestras increased the number of female members from 10% in 1970 to 35% by the mid-1990s. As one can tell, implicit bias clearly was a part in the hiring in both of these studies. So how do we reduce our bias in the hiring process? On your screen, we have 7 practical ways to reduce bias in the hiring process. The first is seeking to understand. In other words, this means that we should examine what our own biases really are and how it relates to the hiring of staff. The second is to rework your job descriptions. In other words, this is to re-examine the word choices that you choose in your job posting. Third is to go blind for the resume review. In other words, examining the resumes of your applicants with disregard to demographics. The fourth is to give a work sample test. This is to examine the work that would actually potentially be done if the candidate is to be hired, regardless again of demographics. The fifth is to standardize interviews. Rather than having a very unstructured interview, ensure that all applicants have a fair opportunity to answer the same set of questions. The sixth is consider likability. If resonating with an applicant regarding common interest and general chemistry matters to you, assign a numerical value so that it is fair for all applicants. And the last is to make sure that you set diversity goals to ensure that it is a priority to eliminate or reduce the bias that you have in your hiring process. Some takeaways from those 7 strategies are to experiment with the wording of your job postings by removing adjectives closely associated to a particular gender. Ask candidates to take work sample tests. It is useful in comparing applicants, and it is an effective predictor of future job performance. Control for your personal feelings about a particular candidate by giving likability a numerical score. Do not engage in unstructured interviews. Instead, standardize your interview process by asking candidates the same set of defined questions. Do not allow for surface demographic characteristics to play into your resume review. Utilize a software program that blinds such information to ensure a level playing field. And then lastly, do not neglect to set diversity goals. Be sure to track how well you are doing on them. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on your hiring process. Throughout the next few moments, feel free to pause this video to take some time to reflect and process on the questions. Where can you identify implicit biases in your hiring process? How often do you examine the word choices on your job listings? How do you utilize a work sample test for candidates to complete? How well do you recognize your own implicit bias regarding your likability of a candidate based on natural chemistry and common interest? How structured is your interview process compared from candidate to candidate? How do you utilize software programs that blind demographic characteristics to ensure a level playing field for candidates? And what are your diversity goals? Please take some time at this moment. Feel free to pause the video and reflect and process on these questions. Thank you for taking the time to reflect and process. Now, while it is important to recognize our own biases, our implicit biases, in our hiring process, it's important to know how do we apply the strategies from this video to reduce or potentially eliminate the bias in our hiring process. Please take some time to reflect and process these strategies as to how you would apply in your own hiring process. Feel free to pause this video at this time. Thank you for taking the time to reflect and process on the questions for this video. I encourage you for professional development to utilize your reflections and your processing to share with your colleagues and your peers in an opportunity to learn from one another to enhance your hiring process to ensure that you are addressing implicit bias. Thank you for tuning in to part 3 of the 3-part series regarding implicit bias. For more information, here are my resources.